Imagine a quiet riverbank, where the water flows slowly and time feels like it's standing still. A child plays at the edge, and the silence is broken only by the rustling of leaves in the breeze. Suddenly, from a shadow beneath the surface, a crocodile emerges. Not just a beast with sharp teeth, but a thinking creature, logical, cold, and precise like a machine. In one swift motion, it seizes the child. The mother, horrified, cries out in desperation. But this crocodile isn't just any predator. He speaks with a calm and curious voice, as if posing a riddle. If you can correctly predict what I will do, I'll return your child. If not, I'll devour her. This is the crocodile paradox, a mental trap not built on brute force, but on the razor's edge of logic, prediction, and self-reference. A dilemma that seems simple at first, but quickly spirals into a maze of contradictory consequences. Now forced to play a game of logic with her child's life on the line, the mother replies, "You will devour her." The crocodile, having promised to return the child if the prediction is correct, finds himself caught in a perfect paradox. If he does devour her, then the mother's prediction was right, and by his promise he must return the child. But if he returns the child to keep his word, then her prediction was wrong, and by that logic, he must devour her. This contradiction creates a closed loop. Any action the crocodile takes violates his own rule. We're face to face with a logical paradox, similar to the classic liar paradox. This sentence is false, a statement that collapses under any attempt to assign it a true or false value. In the case of the crocodile, his action depends on the prediction, and the prediction depends on the action, a logical knot with no stable solution. Philosophers and logicians see the crocodile paradox as a reflection of the problem of self-reference, when a system tries to define itself from within. Bertrand Russell encountered this when exploring the foundations of mathematics and proposed his famous set theory paradox, the set of all sets that do not contain themselves. If it contains itself, then it shouldn't. If it doesn't, then it should. A total collapse of reasoning from the inside out. The crocodile, as a logical predator, represents systems that collapse under the weight of their own rules. He confronts us with a deadlock that's not just intellectual, but deeply human. Because underneath it all, this isn't just a brain teaser. It's about our search for safety in rules, in promises, in reason itself. And here's the cruel irony. The more rational the crocodile is, the more trapped he becomes in the paradox. If he were irrational, he could simply break the rules and choose. But being logical, he's doomed to indecision or contradiction. Just like us, when we demand perfect consistency from complex systems, whether in ethics, politics, or even relationships, and discover that some dilemmas have no clean resolution. This paradox also exposes the fragility of language and trust. The mother believes, or pretends to believe, that she can outwit the crocodile using logic. But if everything hinges on a single interpretation of his promise, then the one who controls the meaning holds the power. Wittgenstein, in exploring the boundaries of language, warned us, the meaning of a proposition only exists within a shared language game. Outside that, everything dissolves. The crocodile may be using words, but the game is his, and the mother is just a piece on the board. At its core, the paradox forces us to confront the weakness of agreements based on prediction. In real life, how often do we believe that if we're just rational enough, we can predict and control outcomes? The stock market, geopolitics, personal relationships, they all carry the illusion that accurate forecasts mean safety. But there are logical crocodiles lurking, ready to tear certainty apart with the teeth of contradiction. Perhaps the only way out is to change the game, not to try and guess what the crocodile will do, but to reject the very structure of the promise. As Karl Popper once said, knowledge grows through conjectures and refutations, not through absolute certainty. Trying to beat the crocodile on his own terms might be the trap. Maybe the real challenge is admitting that some questions have no answer, and some choices, no matter how rational they seem, can't be made without betraying something. In the end, the paradox remains. The crocodile still waits by the riverbank, motionless, eyes half closed, as if waiting for the next victim, not of his jaws, but of the illusion that pure logic can save us from every dilemma. And in that moment, we learn something unsettling. Sometimes, the most dangerous predators aren't the ones hiding in the dark, but the ones that make us believe everything can be solved by reason alone. Imagine a room full of people you know. There's no music, no food, no distractions. Just faces, some familiar, others distant, all quietly observing one another. Some smile, some remain silent. But one thing they all have in common is this. Before entering that room, each person looked into a mirror. Not a mirror that reflects your face, but one that reflects your social value, an invisible mirror, present in every gesture, every like, every comment, or the lack of them. This is the mirror of comparison, and it's quietly shaping how we connect, how we express affection, and how we understand friendship. On social media, friendship has become an ambiguous thing. It brings people closer, and also further apart. It's never been easier to stay in touch with hundreds of people, and yet feel so alone. We like photos, react to stories, send quick messages with carefully chosen emojis, all under the promise that we're connected. But are we, really? This is where the paradox of online friendship emerges. The more tools we have to maintain relationships, the more fragile those relationships become. The ease of communication dilutes the effort, and where there's no effort, there's no depth. Friendship, once built on shared time, lived moments, and silent loyalty, can now be shaken by something as small as a seen but unanswered message, a missed like, or a comment left unmade. Tiny signals that would mean little in the analog world now carry outsized weight in the digital one. It's as if we're all living inside an endless glass display, each person tending to their own image, their own public version of connection, and that's where the mirror of comparison gets stronger. We begin to measure the affection we receive by the affection we see others getting. Why did she comment on their post but not mine? Why does he view my stories but never reply? Why was I left out of that event where everyone else was? Comparison, as Theodore Roosevelt once said, is the thief of joy. And when it enters the realm of friendship, it also steals peace, trust, and space for genuine affection. Philosopher Simone Weil once said that pure attention is the rarest and most generous form of love. But on social media, attention is diluted, fragmented, even monetized. It's no longer freely given. It's fought for. And this shifts the logic of relationships. The other person is no longer an end in themselves, but a mirror in which we seek validation. In that search, friends become numbers, interactions become currency, and human bonds get filtered through algorithms. Psychologist Jonathan Haidt warns that the emotional architecture of social media especially affects the younger generation. They grow up believing their friendships are directly tied to their digital performance. This creates a tragic paradox. Hyper-connected youth who are also increasingly anxious, depressed, and lonely. But is it fair to blame technology alone? Maybe not. Social media amplifies something that has always been there, the human need to belong, to be seen, to be loved. The difference now is that this need is shaped by public metrics. And when recognition becomes a performance, it also becomes unstable. Along with it, so does friendship. Bertrand Russell once said that the desire to be admired is one of the most persistent forces in human nature. The problem is when that desire seeps into our closest relationships, it corrupts them. Friendship stops being a place of refuge and becomes a field of validation, a place where comparison is inevitable and often destructive. So, what's left for us? Abandon social media? Return to handwritten letters and long conversations on park benches? Maybe we don't need to go that far. But maybe we do need a new kind of attention, a conscious effort to separate digital presence from emotional presence, a more generous gaze, less focused on monitoring, a slower kind of listening, but a deeper one. After all, true friendship may not live in the reflections of digital mirrors, but in what happens outside of them, in pauses, in understood absences, in silences that don't need likes to mean love. The paradox of friendship on social media forces a choice. Do we want to be mirrors or windows? Do we want to reflect what's expected of us, or make space for who we really are? Friendship, like all things human, requires imperfection. And perhaps it's in that very imperfection, in the refusal to constantly compare, that it finds its most authentic form. Because as long as we're too busy looking at others, we may miss the ones who are truly by our side. And worse yet, we may fail to be seen for who we really are. In a world that calls itself free, words are both weapon and shield. We walk the streets with phones in our pockets, scrolling through networks where anyone can be a reporter, a philosopher, a judge, or a comedian. We share opinions, criticize, mock, expose, And we do all this under the banner of freedom of speech, one of democracy's most celebrated pillars. But something feels off. The more we champion freedom, the more threatened we feel. The more we claim to welcome every voice, the more anxious we become about those that shout too loud. This is the paradox of tolerance. It was philosopher Karl Popper who defined it most precisely back in 1945. In The Open Society and Its Enemies, he proposed a disturbing idea. For a society to remain truly tolerant, it must be intolerant of intolerance. In other words, if we allow intolerant ideologies to spread unchecked, we risk seeing freedom itself destroyed by those who despise it. It's a logical, ethical, and political trap. To tolerate everything, including what seeks to dismantle tolerance, is to dig our own grave. This dilemma has only become more urgent in the 21st century. Social media has given voice to millions, but it has also amplified hate speech, conspiracy theories, and anti-democratic movements. On one side are those who insist that every form of expression must be allowed in the name of liberty. On the other are those who warn that certain words don't just offend, they endanger lives. So where do we draw the line? Who decides what's tolerable? The tension between freedom of speech and safety is, at its core, a battle over definitions. When someone says something offensive, are they exercising their rights or violating someone else's dignity? When a group preaches hate, are they expressing themselves or laying the groundwork for violence? And when we attempt to silence them, are we protecting society or censoring dissent? There are no easy answers. History is full of examples where once condemned voices sparked essential social change, but it's also full of moments when words paved the way to catastrophe. Nazi Germany's anti-Semitism began with pamphlets, jokes, and rumors. The genocide in Rwanda was incited by radio broadcasts. Violence rarely begins with weapons. It begins with words, and with the permission for those words to grow unchecked. That's why the debate around freedom's limits can't be reduced to slogans. It demands maturity, memory, and moral responsibility. Hannah Arendt reminded us that political freedom isn't the right to do whatever we please. It's the capacity to act together, recognizing that we live in a shared world. Freedom, in this sense, is a common space, one that must be defended, even from those who seek to destroy it. This is where the paradox deepens. By setting limits on speech to protect democracy, we risk weakening it, but by allowing destructive speech to spread freely, we risk losing it entirely. We're caught between two cliffs, repression and permissiveness, and the narrow path between them grows thinner by the day. Digital platforms, governments, and everyday citizens are all facing the same dilemma. How do we ensure that freedom isn't used as a weapon against itself? Is banning a hate-spewing account censorship or caution? Is removing videos filled with disinformation an act of control or an act of responsibility? When everything becomes a culture war, meaningful dialogue becomes nearly impossible. And yet we must try. Because what's at stake isn't just the freedom to speak, but the freedom to exist in a space where mutual respect is possible. A tolerant society isn't one that accepts everything without question. It's one that knows when to say no to that which threatens its very foundation. Maybe the real exercise of freedom is this: knowing when to remain silent so that others may speak, understanding that there are ideas that shouldn't be welcomed in the name of coexistence, recognizing that freedom isn't lawlessness, it's a field bounded by shared responsibilities. The paradox of tolerance forces us to see liberty not as an absolute right, but as a fragile, collective achievement, always vulnerable, always contested. And it reminds us of something crucial, that to truly defend freedom is ultimately to protect it from those who would poison it with the very power of words. You walk into a coffee shop to order a simple cup of coffee, but as you reach the counter, the barista smiles and hands you a menu. Short espresso, long espresso, double, latte, cappuccino, macchiato, mocha, cold brew, drip, organic, medium roast, dark roast, with oat milk, almond milk, lactose-free, with or without sugar. For a moment you freeze. The freedom that once felt so comforting now turns into anxiety, and all you wanted was a coffee. This is the quiet beginning of a modern-day drama. A daily dilemma disguised as progress. The more options we have, the harder it becomes to choose. More than that, it becomes painful, exhausting, frustrating. This is the paradox of choice, a concept popularized by psychologist Barry Schwartz, who questioned one of the core promises of modern life, that more freedom leads to more happiness. On paper, it sounds simple. Giving people more choices respects their autonomy. It treats them as free individuals, capable of shaping their lives based on preferences, values, and desires. But in practice, something strange happens. An abundance of options, rather than empowering us, paralyzes us. It overwhelms the mind, creates a fear of choosing wrong, increases post-decision regret, and feeds the illusion that there's a perfect choice, one that almost always slips through our fingers. The paradox becomes even more cruel when applied to the bigger decisions: career, relationships, life goals. Living in a society where anything is possible should be liberating, but for many, it becomes a mental prison. If you can be anything, then whatever you choose to be carries the burden of all the things you didn't become. Freedom turns into guilt. If something goes wrong, it must be your fault. You made the wrong choice. The responsibility for failure is yours alone. This individualist mindset aligns with the neoliberal spirit, where the person is seen as an entrepreneur of the self. From an early age, we're taught that success depends entirely on our decisions, and nothing else. But that ignores the social context, structural inequalities, and real limitations most people face. Freedom of choice becomes a mirage, visible, desirable, but unreachable for many. Philosophers like Jean-Paul Sartre praised radical human freedom. "We are condemned to be free," he wrote, "but that condemnation comes at a price. In a world where every choice is a statement of identity, even buying a pair of shoes or choosing a movie to watch can feel symbolically heavy. We are what we choose. And if we choose poorly, then who are we?" In the digital age, the paradox deepens. Algorithms offer us infinite possibilities, while also locking us into preference bubbles. They learn from our choices and reflect back versions of ourselves, more predictable, more narrow. The promise was an open world, but often we end up trapped inside the boundaries of our past decisions. Cognitive psychology shows that too many choices lead to decision fatigue, a mental exhaustion that erodes our ability to make sound choices as the day goes on. This is why people like Steve Jobs wore the same outfit every day, not out of a lack of style, but to preserve mental energy. In a world cluttered with trivial decisions, making space for truly important ones becomes an act of rebellion. But the paradox of choice isn't just a psychological issue. It also reveals a cultural failure, the belief that freedom equals quantity. Maybe it's time to reclaim another vision of freedom, one that lies not in multiplicity, but in clarity, not in abundance, but in awareness. Isaiah Berlin, in his distinction between negative and positive liberty, warned that being free to do everything isn't the same as being free to be someone. True freedom might lie less in the number of paths available, and more in the ability to walk one of them with purpose, even if that means saying no to all the others. Ultimately, the paradox of choice invites us to rethink what we mean by freedom. Maybe we're not freer just because we have thousands of options in front of us. Maybe we're freer when we can choose calmly and live in peace with what we've chosen, because in the end, it's not the choice itself that traps us. It's the fear of choosing wrong. It's the expectation of perfection. It's the illusion that somewhere among all the options, there's one that will save us from regret, doubt, or the feeling that something is missing. And maybe that option doesn't exist. Maybe living is, and always will be, choosing with risk and learning to accept that even when we choose carefully, we will never choose without loss. You're in the desert. The sun scorches your skin, the air burns in your lungs, and each step feels heavier than the last. Your body craves just one thing: water. Nothing else matters. Not money, not status, not jewelry. Just a single sip of water. Now imagine that, in the middle of this vast arid landscape, you come across a small velvet box. Inside, a rare, flawless diamond of immeasurable value, and next to it, a bottle of water. Which do you choose? The answer seems obvious: the water. And yet in almost any other setting, the diamond would be worth infinitely more. That's the paradox. The paradox of the diamond and the water, attributed to Adam Smith, the father of modern economics, still challenges our understanding of value to this day. Why is something as essential as water worth so little in the market, while something as non-essential as a diamond commands such a high price? Smith posed the question in the 18th century, observing that while water is vital for life, it has a low market value. whereas diamonds, with little practical use, fetch exorbitant prices. This conflict between use value and exchange value seems to defy our most basic intuition, that the worth of things should reflect their importance. But the world doesn't work that way, and perhaps it never has. Use value refers to the immediate utility of a good, like water, which quenches thirst, irrigates crops, and sustains ecosystems. Exchange value, on the other hand, is based on scarcity, desire, and market dynamics, and that's where diamonds shine. They're rare, hard to acquire, and highly sought after. Their value doesn't come from what they do, but from what they represent: power, beauty, status. In the 19th century, Karl Marx expanded on this idea. For him, the commodity was the starting point for a critique of capitalism. He saw exchange value as a kind of fetishism, an artificial enchantment placed on objects that obscures the social relations and human labor behind them. The diamond holds value because it's a social symbol, not because it's essential. Water, in contrast, remains invisible in the marketplace because it's abundant, at least for now. This paradox forces us to take a more critical look at the world. When did we start valuing symbols more than sustenance? Why is a luxury car admired more than a school teacher? Why is street art worth less than a signed canvas, even when it speaks louder? We live surrounded by assigned values, not always fair, not always logical. Psychologist and Nobel laureate Daniel Kahneman showed that our economic decisions are driven more by emotion and context than by pure reason. The irrationality of value isn't the exception, it's the rule. We buy with our eyes, with our fears, with our longing to belong, and more often than not, we pay more for what seems rare than for what truly matters. But the paradox of the diamond and the water isn't just economic, it's existential. It makes us ask, what are we truly valuing in our lives? The things that shine, or the things that sustain us? The experiences that make a splash, or the quiet ones that keep us standing? In a world where the glitter often seduces more than the need, we risk forgetting what's essential. And we often realize its value only when it's gone. We remember the importance of water only when there's none, of health only when we're sick, of peace only when there's war. The real value of things often reveals itself in absence. At its core, perhaps this paradox is a mirror of our priorities, and a quiet warning that we might be living upside down, collecting diamonds while ignoring our thirst. Meanwhile, the water keeps flowing, silent, vital, humble, without a price that matches its worth, but with a value beyond measure. Imagine a vast, green, shared field. In the center, cows graze peacefully. Each farmer in the village can leave his animals there, because the field belongs to everyone. At first, there is a balance. Each farmer takes care not to overgraze the pasture, because he knows that his livelihood, and that of his neighbors, depends on it. But then the temptation arises. If I add one more cow, my personal profit will increase, and the impact will be minimal, and the neighbor thinks the same. And the next one too. Soon the field is degraded, the cows die, the village collapses. Everyone acted rationally for themselves, and in the end, everyone lost. This is the paradox of thrift, better known by the metaphor of the tragedy of the commons, formulated by Garrett Hardin. A dilemma that exposes the tension between individual interest and the collective good. The problem is not bad intentions, it is rational logic applied to a collective system, the logic of self-sabotage. When we talk about parsimony, we are talking about moderation, about restraining the urge to have more, use more, exploit more. But the paradox is that, when trying to preserve the common good, the individual can feel wronged, especially when he sees others acting opportunistically. The temptation to get it while it lasts is enormous, and that is where self-sabotage comes into play. By protecting only his own immediate interest, the individual is paving the way for the collapse of the system on which he depends. This is not just true for pastures and cows. Think about climate change. Every country knows that reducing emissions is essential, but it also knows that this is costly, that it implies losing competitiveness, voters, power, so it hesitates. It waits for others to take the lead, and everyone waiting for the others advances into the abyss together. The same goes for garbage, for water consumption, for the over-exploitation of natural resources, and also for more subtle behaviors, in traffic, when using public spaces, on social networks. Everyone sees themselves as an exception. Just today, just a little, just with me. But the sum of the alones is chaos. And the cruelest thing is that no one wants to destroy the collective. But the sum of selfishness unintentionally builds the common ruin. Thomas Hobbes warned in the 17th century about the dangers of unbridled selfishness. In his Leviathan, he saw human beings as driven by their own interests, which would lead them, without a power to impose order, to a war of all against all. Rousseau, more optimistic, believed that the social pact could emerge from collective reason, from the awareness that living together requires mutual limits. But the paradox of parsimony shows that awareness is not enough. The problem is not only ethical, it is structural. A system where cooperation is voluntary and punishment for generosity is real tends to collapse. Those who sacrifice themselves for the collective may end up harmed, and this generates resentment, distrust, and giving up. The solution often seems to be external regulation, laws, norms, punishments. But this is not always possible, nor desirable. And so, an uncomfortable question arises. Would it be possible to cultivate genuine voluntary parsimony in a world that rewards excess? Behavioral psychology studies, such as those by Dan Ariely, show that people tend to collaborate more when they feel there is justice, reciprocity, and belonging, when they see the impact of their actions, when they trust that others are also doing their part. In other words, the problem is not a lack of morality, but a lack of connections. Self-sabotage arises from moral loneliness, from the feeling that we are acting alone amid opportunists. And to break this cycle, we need more than good arguments. We need to create communities, networks of trust, collective narratives, because in the end, the paradox of parsimony is also a lesson in interdependence. We do not live on islands. What we do, fail to do, or pretend not to see, comes back around. The collective good is not an abstraction. It is the air we breathe, the water we drink, the future we leave for our children. The logic of self-sabotage may seem inevitable, but perhaps the real challenge of our time is precisely learning to curb the urge to do just a little more, to accept that sometimes the best thing for you is to let go, and that true freedom does not lie in doing everything you can, but in choosing, together, what is worth preserving. For decades, the world lived under a silent threat. It was the time of the Cold War, when two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, maintained weapons capable of destroying the planet several times over, and yet they did not confront each other directly. Millions of soldiers, thousands of nuclear warheads, sophisticated military strategies, all of this contained by an almost absurd logic, stability arising from the mutual fear of total destruction. And at the same time, the world was seething with smaller conflicts, proxy wars, espionage, sabotage, and ideological disputes. This is the essence of the stability-instability paradox, a geopolitical paradox that says the more stable the balance between great powers, especially when nuclear weapons are involved, the greater the likelihood of indirect, localized, or asymmetric conflicts arising. When total war is unthinkable, violence finds other paths, smaller, more subtle, more fragmented, but still lethal. The concept was formalized by Glenn Snyder in the 1960s, and it has become a powerful lens for understanding why the world, even without world wars, has never been truly at peace. If nuclear war is guaranteed suicide for both sides, deterrence prevents direct confrontation. But paradoxically, this same strategic stability leaves room for adventures in marginal territories, where the risk of full-blown escalation is unlikely. During the Cold War, Vietnam, Korea, Afghanistan, Angola, Central America, all became theaters of proxy wars. The conflicts did not directly involve the two giants, but were fueled by their resources, ideologies, and interests. Stability at the top generated instability at the bottom. Today, this paradox is reconfigured in new arenas. Cybersecurity is perhaps the most emblematic example. Great powers avoid devastating cyber attacks that could generate massive retaliation. But at the same time, they promote smaller invasions, interference in elections, theft of strategic data, all under the veil of plausible deniability. Digital warfare is constant, but carefully calibrated so as not to cross the line into open warfare, a permanent conflict that does not admit itself as such. In the economy, the paradox also manifests itself. Highly interdependent markets create a kind of stability. Everyone has something to lose. so they avoid drastic ruptures. But this also encourages covert predatory practices, currency manipulation, dumping, industrial espionage. Mutual trust, while preventing immediate collapses, also encourages covert power plays. And in politics, we see the same pattern. Countries with stable institutions avoid coups and revolutions, but they are not immune to extreme polarizations, informational manipulations, and the gradual erosion of democracies. The perception of stability gives rise to symbolic conflicts, cultural wars, and underground power struggles. It is the apparent peace that masks an ongoing war, fought behind the scenes, on social media, in narratives. This paradox teaches us something profound about the role of risk perception. The world does not react only to what is real, but to what appears to be. When the risk of a devastating response is certain, as in the case of nuclear retaliation, it inhibits action. But when the risk is ambiguous, distant, and unlikely, it encourages calculated boldness. The line between courage and provocation becomes blurred, and conflicts shift to where the cost of action seems low and the punishment uncertain. There is also a psychological lesson here. We often seek stability as synonymous with security, but we ignore the fact that, in complex systems, stability can hide latent tensions. A society where confrontation is repressed can accumulate frustrations that eventually explode. A relationship where everything seems calm can hide deep disconnections. Apparent peace does not guarantee harmony. Sometimes it postpones conflict and makes it harder to resolve when it does come. The philosophy of deterrence, if everyone is afraid, no one will attack, works until it doesn't. And this is true of global politics, democratic institutions, social dynamics, and even technology. We live surrounded by systems that are stable only on the surface, but the subsoil is often shaking. The stability-instability paradox warns us. What protects us can also expose us. The absence of war is not synonymous with peace. Perceived stability can fuel more sophisticated forms of conflict, and the greatest risk, perhaps, is to believe that there are no more risks. In the end, it is not the absence of tension that defines peace, but our ability to face it without denying its existence. Because silence among bombs is not the same as tranquility among people. And, as history insists on showing, it is in the spaces where we think we are safe that conflict often finds new forms of survival. You remember a sunny Sunday, without commitments, without pressure. Everything seems conducive to a happy day. Então você decide. Hoje vou be happy. Play an upbeat playlist. Make a special coffee. Put on more comfortable clothes. But, as the day progresses, something strange happens. You feel a diffuse restlessness, a slight frustration. And he asks himself, why, even doing everything right, don't I feel happy as I should? This sensation, together with what is disconcerting, is the heart of the paradox of hedonism. Happiness escapes when it is directly pursued. The paradox was first articulated by philosopher Henry Sidgwick and later taken up by John Stuart Mill, who wrote, "Those who seek happiness directly only find the least. It is, like health, best achieved when it is not the primary objective." In other words, the more we strive to be happy, the more we realize, or the more we are not there. In the era of positive psychology, of the culture of happiness, and two algorithms that sell optimism, happiness comes from a product, a measurable objective, something to be conquered, improved, monitored, like a body in an academy. But this approach, embora seductive, tends to transform happiness into more of a task, and tasks, by definition, need to be pressed. Happiness, as shown in contemporary psychology, is a byproduct. It does not spring from effort and feeling, but from involvement with something greater than itself. Researchers like Martin Seligman and Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi will show that truly satisfying experiences are those in which we make sense of ourselves, when we are in flow, when we serve a purpose, when we feel connected to something that transcends our own purpose. The paradox of hedonism is, therefore, an error of focus. Happiness is not about momentary praise, but about coherentia between what we live and what we value, the difference between prayer and meaning. You can be on a paradisiacal beach and feel empty. You could be cleaning a friend's house and feel deep joy, because the emotional context is shaped not only by stimulus, but by intention. Nescience, or mindfulness, attenzione plena, emerges as a powerful response. Being present, without playing, without searching, just inhabiting a moment like this, allows happiness to appear if it happens by accident. The philosopher Alan Watts said that living trying to be happy is like trying to grab water with your fingers. The more you open it, the more it escapes with your fingers. Happiness, like water, requires lightness, dedication, presence. The problem is that we live in a culture that does not know how to be light, that demands from us not just productivity but emotional performance. We need to appear happy, be motivated, show constant gratitude, even when we are exhausted. As social networks, there are showcases of this press. Carefully chosen smiles, uplifting legends, self-care routines that seem more like days of emotional work. And when we can't feel that way, we blame ourselves, as unhappiness becomes a personal failure. The culture of emotional performance creates a cruel paradox. Whether it forces us to be happy or all the time, it sabotages precisely the conditions for it. Instead of oiling the natural oscillation of life, the moments of boredom, sleep, doubt, we try to hide them. And therefore, we are afraid of authenticity, which is one of the deepest roots of being. A direct search for happiness is also in another question, a comparison. When happiness becomes a socially visible objective, we begin to measure it based on each other. And as economist Richard Easterlin pointed out, our sense of well-being does not depend only on how much we have, but on how much we have in relation to others. The result is an interminable game of dissatisfaction. Maybe the way is to rephrase the question. Instead of how to be happy, perhaps we should ask, what is my life worth? This change in focus prevents us from praising superficially and brings us closer to two intrinsic values, those that we cultivate not because we create rewards, but because we reflect who we really are. Happiness then stops being an objective and becomes a consequence of living with meaning, of committing to something, of oiling the imperfection of the present, to abandon the idea that life should be an eternal emotional varon. The paradox of hedonism alerts us. There is nothing for joy. And perhaps it is precisely when he stops chasing her that she finally approaches, like a timid animal that is scared by the noise of anxiety, but is scared on our side when we simply breathe. There is a silent beauty in the oil that the world does not fit in the lines of challenge. There are questions that don't have a single answer. That there are certain choices that we do, and errors that seem more than successes. Living is, essentially, inhabiting contradictions. And the paradoxes, long of being mere logical exercises, only the contours visivis dessa complexity, small janellas where we spy on the limits of reason. In every paradox, have a treat, an invitation to think anew, to question certainties, to realize that two opposing ideas can, strangely, be true at the same time. How are the paradoxes formed? Maps of a mental geography that is not guided only by binary logic, but by curves, detours, tensions. It does not show a safe path, but indicates where the road is no longer simple. The philosophical tradition, or paradox, always occupies a special place. Zeno, to affirm that Achilles would never reach a Tartaruga, did not want to reveal a bullfight, but to destabilize our confidence in perception. Gödel, proving that there are truths that cannot be proven within a logical system, does not lead us to ignorance, but rather to humility. Wittgenstein, to say that about what cannot be falsified must be understood, advocates the space of mystery, not as a failure of language, but as an opening to the indicible. Nescience, the paradoxes are not obstacles to knowing. You are only supposed to know or not, and I don't know, long after being fraqueza, it can be strength. We live in an era obsessed by quick answers, by definitive solutions, by strong opinions. But perhaps the true sign of intelligence and maturity is the ability to live with life, to support ideas without needing to solve them, to live with questions without specifying dates. Contemporary psychology is beginning to reconstitute this. The idea of cognitive complexity, studied by researchers such as Peter Sudfeld and Jordan Peterson in their initial work, shows that people capable of keeping multiple perspectives in mind, even when conflicting, tend to deal better with the real world, which is rarely simple. Living with ambiguity is, paradoxically, a form of clarity. The paradoxes also express something deeply human, the tension between what we feel and what we think, between what we want and what we know to be true, between the impulse and the principle. We are contradictory beings by nature. We wish freedom and belonging, security and adventure, recognition and anonymity. We want to be unique and at the same time, oils. This is the dance of opposites that we are sculpting into identity. In life, in the end, it is not resolved. She sustains herself. The value of two paradoxes is exactly in our mind. They do not serve to be overcome, but to be inhabited, so that we can move inside them with more awareness, more flexibility, less rigidity. Nietzsche said that the great truth that a man can endure indicates his strength. Perhaps we can paraphrase it. The degree of contradiction that someone can sustain indicates their knowledge. Not the one that imposes certainties, but the one that cushions the real in its integrity, even when it defies all logic. Living with uncertainty is, therefore, a virtue, a rare but necessary virtue, because it is only necessary for listening, empathy, critical thinking, and opening for something new. It is what allows you to change ideas without losing integrity, that allows you to reconfirm your limits without giving up your search. That allows, in short, to be fully human, aware that there is no final answer, only provisional paths. The paradoxes, like twisted mirrors, reveal these depths. They don't tell us what to think. Deism, I thought better. Feel more fun. Oil less prompt responses. And above all, learn to live with the disturbing beauty of a world that does not fit perfectly, because it is the lack of courage that dwells in the freedom to think and in the courage to be.